Jamal Thompson had grown accustomed to the unwarranted suspicion that came with being a black man in a predominantly white city. Over the years, the oppressive weight of racial profiling had become almost second nature, like the air he breathed. So constant and invisible that it was easy to ignore, but not tonight. Tonight, the usual discomfort had ripened into something more dangerous. The city streets were quiet, save for the sound of his boots on the cracked pavement as he walked back to his apartment. His workday had ended. His hands were sore from hours spent fixing engines at the mechanic shop, and his stomach rumbled in protest. All he wanted was to get home and relax, maybe eat some leftovers his mother had sent over. Jamal wasn't in a hurry. It was the kind of night that made everything feel calm, like time was stretching just a little longer to allow him a moment of peace. The hum of distant traffic blended with the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, but otherwise, the night was quiet. That was until the screech of tires broke the silence. Jamal didn't have to look over his shoulder to know it was a police car pulling up behind him. The sound was unmistakable, and the instinctual knot in his stomach tightened. He knew this game all too well. He had played it for years, with every stop, every question, every raised eyebrow. The only difference was that tonight, Jamal didn't think he had done anything to deserve it. He could hear the car's engine sputter to a stop, followed by the sharp sound of a door slamming. Jamal's heart picked up pace, and his body tensed. "Hey, you!" a voice called out. Jamal turned around slowly, already sensing the unease that came with this kind of encounter. The officer who had stepped out of the car was Officer Thomas Caldwell. Jamal had seen him around before, walking the beat or sitting in his patrol car, but they had never directly interacted. Jamal knew enough about Caldwell's reputation. He was the type of officer who didn't think twice about assuming the worst of anyone, especially when it came to young black men in his patrol area. "What's the problem, officer?" Jamal asked, trying to keep his voice steady, even though the nerves in his chest were beginning to tighten. Caldwell didn't answer right away. He looked Jamal up and down, the suspicion clear in his eyes. There was an edge to the officer's gaze, a kind of cold, calculated hostility that Jamal had seen before. It was the way some cops looked at people like him, black, young, and male, as though his very existence was a threat to their authority. "I'm just walking home," Jamal said, raising an eyebrow as the officer continued to eye him. "I'm not doing anything wrong." Caldwell didn't even acknowledge the explanation. Instead, he took a few steps closer. Jamal could smell the stale scent of coffee and cigarettes on the officer's uniform, a familiar mix he had learned to associate with every cop that came through his neighborhood. "Let me see your ID," Caldwell ordered flatly. The request was standard, but Jamal's gut churned. He had dealt with enough situations like this to know the drill. Cops who assumed he was guilty without evidence, officers who treated him as though he was a criminal simply by virtue of the color of his skin. Jamal wasn't new to this, but tonight, something about it felt different. "I don't have to show you my ID, officer," Jamal replied, trying to keep his voice calm but firm. "I'm not breaking any laws." Caldwell's lips tightened. Jamal could feel the officer's frustration rising, and it made him uneasy. He had seen this before, where an officer's ego was bruised because someone dared to question their authority. And while Jamal had learned how to navigate these situations without escalating things, tonight it felt like something was about to snap. "Let me see your ID now," Caldwell barked, his voice growing sharper. Jamal could feel the tension building, a familiar sensation creeping into his chest. His breathing became a little heavier. He could already feel the energy in the air shift from suspicion to outright aggression. Jamal had learned from his older brother Tyrell, who had been stopped by officers more times than he could count, that refusing to comply could end poorly, no matter how in the right he might be. The power dynamic in these situations was almost always tilted in the officer's favor. But Jamal wasn't just any man on the street. He wasn't going to back down or just comply without question. He couldn't. "I'm not going to show you my ID," Jamal said, his voice shaking slightly, but resolute. "I haven't done anything wrong." There was a brief, unnerving pause. Caldwell didn't immediately react, but Jamal could see his jaw tense, the officer's hand twitching at his side. Jamal's eyes locked with his, and for a split second, Jamal thought he saw something flicker in the officer's expression, something akin to a challenge, or maybe even a sense of disbelief. Then, with sudden force, Caldwell grabbed Jamal's arm. The shock of it made Jamal flinch, and his heart skipped. The officer's grip was ironclad as he pulled Jamal toward the patrol car. "Let go of me," Jamal shouted, pulling his arm away, but Caldwell's hold didn't loosen. The officer's face was cold, his eyes fixed with a predatory determination. "You think you can walk around here like you own the place, huh?" Caldwell's voice dripped with disdain, and Jamal felt his blood begin to boil. "I'm just walking home, man," Jamal said, trying to twist his wrist free. The burning sensation where Caldwell's fingers dug into his skin sent a jolt of panic through his chest, but Jamal pushed it down. "You don't need to do this." "Yeah, right," Caldwell sneered. "I know the kind of trouble you're probably mixed up in." Jamal's pulse raced. He had been called a criminal before, but hearing it from this officer stung. He had done nothing wrong, and yet this man was treating him as though he was guilty of something just by standing there. The system had taught him this was normal. The racist assumptions, the criminalization of black bodies, the presumption that someone like him was always up to no good. But tonight, Jamal wasn't going to just stand there and take it. Jamal met the officer's gaze. "I'm not your enemy. I'm not some criminal. I'm a human being," he said, his voice rising despite his best efforts to stay calm. Caldwell's eyes hardened. "Shut up," he snapped, pushing Jamal harder against the squad car. "You're not in charge here." Jamal's chest tightened as he felt the officer's weight pressing against him. His thoughts scrambled for an escape. Some way to talk his way out of this without making the situation worse. He knew what could happen if he pushed back too hard. He had heard the horror stories. The cops who escalated things just to assert their dominance. The black men who had died after being restrained or subdued. But in the back of his mind, Jamal also felt something stirring. There was a moment of clarity amidst the chaos. His body was reacting out of sheer survival instinct, but his mind was calm. His heart was still racing, but there was a flicker of hope, small but unmistakable, that maybe, just maybe, things didn't have to escalate this time. With every ounce of self-control, Jamal took a slow, deep breath. "Listen," he said, his voice quieter now but still firm. "You're making a mistake. I'm not your enemy. I'm just trying to get home." For a moment, the officer didn't respond. Caldwell stood there, gripping Jamal's arm, his eyes narrowing as he processed Jamal's words. The tension between them hung thick in the air. For the first time, the officer seemed unsure, uncertain of himself, as if something had caused a shift in his thinking. The seconds stretched on, and Jamal kept his gaze steady. "I'm not here to fight you," he said. "I'm just a person trying to live my life. I'm not a threat." It was a simple statement, but something in those words seemed to land with Caldwell. Jamal could see the flicker of doubt in the officer's eyes. His grip on Jamal's arm loosened, just slightly. There was hesitation in the way he stood, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Jamal saw the officer take a half step back. I didn't mean to," Caldwell stammered, his voice faltering for a brief moment. His posture relaxed just a fraction. Jamal didn't move. He waited. "I'm sorry," the officer said, his voice softer, more human than before. "I shouldn't have." Jamal stood there, stunned. The apology wasn't something he had expected, and yet, there it was, hanging between them in the night air. He didn't know what to make of it. But Jamal wasn't interested in apologies. He wasn't looking for pity or words that meant nothing. What mattered was that something had shifted. "You don't have to apologize," Jamal said finally. "You just need to change." With a last glance at the officer, Jamal turned and walked away, his footsteps growing fainter as he moved down the street. He wasn't sure what the future held for Officer Caldwell. He wasn't sure if that moment would change anything, but in the silence that followed, Jamal couldn't help but feel a faint spark of hope that perhaps he had been part of something bigger than just one interaction. As Jamal continued his walk home, he didn't know if things would ever fully change, but he did know one thing for certain: standing up for himself, speaking his truth, and showing kindness in the face of hostility was worth it, even if the impact wasn't immediately clear. And in that, Jamal found a quiet but unwavering sense of resilience. The fight for equality and respect was long, but it was far from over. Jamal Thompson had walked the streets of his neighborhood 1,000 times before. A born and raised resident of the city, he knew the cracks in the pavement, the familiar smell of exhaust fumes mixed with fresh bread from the local bakery, and the hum of old streetlights that barely flickered to life after dusk. But there was always something lurking in the background, something that he couldn't escape, the constant hum of police sirens, the flash of blue lights in the distance, the nagging feeling that no matter what he did or where he went, he would always be looked at as a threat. As a black man, this was his reality. Tonight, however, was different. Jamal wasn't particularly nervous. He had done his best to ignore the ever-present weight of the world's bias. But as he strolled down the quiet street, the faint but unmistakable sound of screeching tires reached his ears. It was a sound that always made his heart skip a beat, the sound of a car pulling up behind him. The sound of police officers taking an interest. Jamal's stomach tightened. The rational part of his mind knew there was nothing to be afraid of. He had every right to walk these streets just like anyone else. But the constant experience of racial profiling made him feel vulnerable, like an innocent man in a world that saw him as anything but. He tried to shake off the unease. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe they were just passing by. But then he heard it. "Hey, you!" The sharp, authoritative tone cut through the night air, sending a jolt of adrenaline through Jamal's veins. He turned around slowly, already recognizing the voice. Officer Thomas Caldwell, a cop with a reputation that stretched far beyond the street he patrolled. Caldwell was known in the neighborhood for his aggressive stance toward black men. For a cop who had only recently joined the force, Caldwell seemed to have an unusual fondness for pulling over people who looked like Jamal, especially young black men who were minding their own business. Jamal had never interacted with him before, but he had seen the officer's scowling face more times than he cared to remember, and the way Caldwell looked at him now told Jamal everything he needed to know. "What's the problem, officer?" Jamal asked, his voice measured and calm, though inside, his heart was racing. He wasn't sure if his calmness would be seen as defiance or submission. He wasn't even sure if it mattered. "Step over here," Caldwell ordered, not even bothering with pleasantries. Jamal could feel the officer's eyes scrutinizing him, as if he were already guilty of something. Jamal's stomach churned. He could feel the invisible weight of suspicion pressing down on him. The worst part wasn't the encounter itself. It was the realization that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a system that had been built on generations of people like Jamal being constantly policed, scrutinized, and criminalized, regardless of whether they had done anything wrong. "I'm just walking home," Jamal said, his voice steady, but he felt the familiar tension rising. He could already sense where this was headed. He didn't know how many times he had had this conversation before, but he knew it wouldn't end well. Caldwell's eyes narrowed as he took in Jamal's appearance. The officer's gaze traveled up and down Jamal's body, sizing him up. "Let me see your ID," Caldwell demanded. The words were clipped, as if he had already decided that Jamal was guilty of something. "I don't need to show you my ID," Jamal replied, his voice calm but insistent. His pulse quickened, but he refused to be intimidated. He had learned long ago that if he didn't stand firm, people would walk all over him. "I'm not committing any crime. I'm just trying to go home." Caldwell didn't seem to care. The officer's expression hardened. Jamal could feel the anger radiating off him, and Jamal realized with a sickening certainty that this wasn't about anything he had done. It was about the officer's belief that someone who looked like him was always guilty until proven innocent. "You don't get to tell me what you will or won't do," Caldwell snapped. Taking a step closer, Jamal stiffened, but he kept his ground. "Show me your ID, now." Jamal's mind raced, weighing his options. He knew that he wasn't legally required to show his ID unless he was being detained or arrested, but refusing Caldwell might escalate things. He could already feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, like a powder keg about to explode. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to walk away, to just keep moving, but the officer's voice and presence had a grip on him that felt suffocating. Jamal had learned how to read situations like this. He had been stopped too many times. He had seen what happened when things went south. The officer was itching for a reason to make this his fight. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Jamal said again, his voice shaking only slightly. "You can't just stop people for no reason." But Caldwell wasn't listening. The officer's frustration boiled over, and without warning, his hand shot out to grab Jamal's arm. The sudden force of it took Jamal by surprise, but his reflexes kicked in, pulling his arm away from Caldwell's grasp. Jamal's pulse was now thundering in his ears. His heart pounded so loudly in his chest that it almost drowned out everything else. For a split second, Jamal considered running, He could make a break for it, get away, but that was always a dangerous move. It wasn't just about running from the officer. It was about the consequences of resisting. He had heard too many stories about black men who had run from cops only to end up in worse situations. He could feel Caldwell's grip tighten on his wrist again, pulling him closer toward the squad car. "I said, let go!" Jamal shouted, trying to pull away once more, but the officer's hold was too strong. Caldwell's face was flushed with anger now, his lips drawn tight in a sneer. "You think you can just walk around here, acting like you own the place?" The words stung, cutting deeper than Jamal cared to admit. He could feel the officer's hatred, the assumption that he was guilty of something just by existing in the space. It wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising, but it didn't make it any less painful. "I'm just trying to get home," Jamal said, his voice quieter this time, but his resolve still strong. He wasn't going to fight back physically, but his words were all he had left. "I'm not doing anything illegal. You can't just stop me like this." Caldwell didn't respond immediately. Instead, the officer glared at him, sizing him up once again. Jamal stood his ground, feeling the heat of the officer's glare, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to give in to the assumption that he was somehow less than. For a long moment, Caldwell said nothing. His eyes locked with Jamal's, a tense silence hanging between them. Jamal could hear his own breath, slow but steady, as the tension in the air grew unbearable. And then, as if the weight of the moment had finally registered with the officer, Caldwell's hand slowly released Jamal's wrist. Jamal didn't move, though he could feel the relief in his body as the officer's grip loosened. Caldwell stepped back, just a little, like he was unsure of how to proceed. Jamal's gaze never wavered from the officer's, but he didn't speak. The silence that fell between them was thick with uncertainty. Uncertainty from the officer, but also from Jamal. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he felt something shift in the air. The officer didn't seem so sure anymore. The anger in his eyes had softened slightly, replaced with something else, perhaps a sense of confusion, or maybe doubt. "I'm sorry," Caldwell muttered, almost too quietly for Jamal to hear. It wasn't an apology Jamal had been expecting, but the words felt like a crack in the wall that had been built between them. He didn't know what to say. He had heard those words before, but they had always felt hollow. Tonight, though, there was something different. Jamal couldn't quite place it, but he wasn't going to argue. Jamal took a deep breath. "You don't need to apologize," he said. "You just need to understand. People like me aren't the enemy. We're just trying to live." For a second, Caldwell didn't reply. He just stared at Jamal, his eyes flickering with a mix of emotions. The officer seemed to be searching for something in Jamal, something that was suddenly more human than the hostility he had shown earlier. He took another step back, his hands falling to his sides. I'll let you go," Caldwell said, his voice almost hesitant now. Jamal nodded, but before he turned to leave, he offered the officer one last piece of advice. "It's not enough to just stop for a second. You need to do better. You need to change how you see people like me."